December 17, 1944. A farmhouse cellar outside Schönberg, in the rolling fog-choked hills of the Belgian Ardennes. The air smells of cordite, wet wool, and the diesel exhaust of idling half-tracks somewhere above. A German staff officer of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division crouches over a map table that is not his own. It has been pulled, still warm from use, from the command post of an American infantry regiment that surrendered barely 2 hours earlier. He unfolds it under the weak beam of a torch, and for a moment he simply stares. It is not the terrain that stops him. He knows this ground. His own division has fought over these ridgelines for 3 days. What stops him is the paper itself. Grid references overlaid in precise colored pencil, supply routes annotated down to the individual crossroads, artillery fire plans cross-referenced to map sheets he did not know existed, minefield boundaries marked with a confidence that suggests they were laid days ago and updated hourly since. He has spent 5 years of war making do with pre-war Michelin tourist maps, hand-traced overlays, and aerial photographs that arrive, when they arrive at all, a week too late to matter. Though what lies in front of him now looks less like a battlefield sketch than an engineering drawing of the war itself. He is not the only one. In the chaos of the German breakthrough into the Ardennes that week, unit after unit stumbles onto the same discovery. Captured jeeps yield map cases stuffed with sheets printed to a common, ruthlessly consistent standard. Prisoners taken near Schnee Eifel, where 2 regiments of the American 106th Infantry Division would surrender nearly 7,000 men in a single day, carry identical grids in their map pockets down to the private soldier. For an army that has learned to prize improvisation because it has so rarely been given the alternative, the sheer bureaucratic completeness of it is almost harder to process than the American artillery that has been falling on their columns since dawn. This is not a story about a single dramatic secret weapon, the kind that usually anchors a film like this. There is no ray gun, no miracle alloy, no device that changes the shape of a battle in an instant. It is, instead, a story about paper, about grids, datums, overprints, and the unglamorous machinery of the United States Army Map Service, and about how the accumulated, patient work of cartographers and surveyors on both sides of the Atlantic became, in December 1944, a genuine and unwelcome surprise to the Army that had spent years believing it held the intelligence advantage. What that German officer held in his hands in a Schönberg cellar was the product of an industrial mapping effort so vast, so standardized, and so quietly effective that it had outpaced anything the Wehrmacht could match. Understanding why that moment stopped him cold means understanding just how badly. By the winter of 1944, Germany had lost the war of the map. It is worth pausing on why a map, of all things, deserves an hour of anyone's time. Modern audiences are accustomed to thinking of military history through its hardware: the Tiger tank, the Sherman, the 88mm gun that could open a hull like a tin of sardines. Paper does not photograph well. It does not roar or flash or leave craters, but every one of those machines was useless without an answer to a far more basic question, one that sounds almost embarrassingly simple until you try to answer it under artillery fire in a forest at night. Where, precisely, am I? Where is my enemy, and how do I tell the man 10 kilometers away exactly what I can see? That question, repeated 1,000,000 times a day across a modern battlefield, is what a map answers or fails to answer. By December 1944, the 2 armies fighting through the Ardennes were answering it in radically different ways, and the gap between those answers was about to become impossible to hide. To understand why a piece of paper could produce that reaction, it helps to step back from the Ardennes entirely and ask a more basic question. What, precisely, does an army need from a map in order to fight effectively? And why is that need so much harder to satisfy in 1944 than it sounds? A map used for planning a summer maneuver in peacetime can afford to be years out of date. Roads do not move, rivers do not relocate. And the enemy, in peacetime, is a hypothetical rather than a column of tanks 2 ridgelines away. A map used in the 5th winter of a total war fought across a continent is an entirely different kind of object. It must be accurate to the meter in places where a single misplaced contour line can send an infantry company into a killing ground. It must be current to the day, sometimes the hour, in a landscape where minefields, roadblocks, and unit boundaries can shift overnight. And why is that need so much harder to satisfy in 1944 than it sounds? A map used for planning a summer maneuver in peacetime can afford to be years out of date. Roads do not move, rivers do not relocate, and the enemy, in peacetime, is a hypothetical rather than a column of tanks 2 ridgelines away. A map used in the 5th winter of a total war fought across a continent is an entirely different kind of object. It must be accurate to the meter in places where a single misplaced contour line can send an infantry company into a killing ground. It must be current to the day, sometimes the hour, in a landscape where minefields, roadblocks, and unit boundaries can shift overnight. And it must be produced and distributed at a volume that keeps pace with an army numbering millions of men, spread across hundreds of kilometers of front, each of whom needs, in some form, to know where he is standing. For most of the Second World War, the two sides fought with radically different relationships to the ground beneath their feet. Germany had entered the conflict with genuinely excellent cartography. The Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme and its military successors had produced fine topographic coverage of Central Europe before 1939, and the Wehrmacht's early campaigns benefited enormously from maps that were detailed, accurate, and readily available for the terrain closest to home. But war has an appetite for paper that peacetime surveying was never built to satisfy, and Germany's mapping capacity, like so much of its industrial base, began to fray the moment the fighting moved beyond ground its surveyors already knew intimately. By 1944, the problem had become acute. German formations retreating across France, Belgium, and the western fringes of the Reich itself were increasingly forced to rely on requisitioned civilian road atlases, pre-war tourist maps, and captured Allied material. Precisely the kind of material this documentary opens with, because their own survey organizations simply could not keep pace with a front that moved hundreds of kilometers in a matter of months. Aerial photographic reconnaissance, the essential raw material for updating any map to reflect a battlefield's true current state, had once been a German strength. By late 1944, it was in collapse. Allied air superiority over Western Europe was, by this point in the war, close to absolute. German reconnaissance aircraft that tried to overfly Allied positions were shot down in large numbers, and the photographic units that processed whatever imagery did return were themselves being bombed, relocated, and starved of fuel and film stock. A staff officer in December 1944 might have a superb 1930s topographic sheet of the Ardennes, showing every village and stream with beautiful precision, and simultaneously have no reliable way of knowing where the American front line actually sat that morning, where new minefields had been sown overnight, or which bridges had been reinforced to take the weight of a Sherman tank rather than a farm cart. There is a further irony worth dwelling on, one that would not have been lost on the more historically minded officers picking through captured American paperwork that December. Germany had, before the war, possessed one of the finest surveying and cartographic traditions in Europe, a legacy of 19th-century Prussian state science that had produced meticulous topographic coverage of Central Europe decades before most of the continent's other powers had managed anything comparable. That tradition had not vanished. Its practitioners were, in many cases, still alive, still capable, still working in the Reichsamt's shrinking offices in Berlin and Potsdam. What had vanished was the industrial capacity to turn that expertise into current, mass-produced, forward-deployed material at the pace a mobile war now demanded. Skill without throughput is, in a total war, close to useless. A single brilliant cartographer working with hand tools could not match an American reproduction pipeline built around dozens of portable presses running around the clock, however much more refined his individual draftsmanship might be. Compounding this was a deeper structural weakness. German mapping organizations, like much of the German war economy, had never been fully unified. Army, Luftwaffe, and various regional survey bodies produced material using overlapping but not always compatible grid systems and datums, meaning a map reference passed from one unit to another could not always be trusted to mean quite the same thing on both ends. Paper itself, along with the printing presses, skilled lithographers, and chemical processing plants needed to turn survey data into usable sheets, was in desperately short supply by the last full year of the war, competing for resources against munitions production and increasingly disrupted by Allied strategic bombing of German industrial centers. Some German units advancing into the Ardennes in December 1944 were still working from maps that predated the war by a decade or more, annotated by hand with whatever fragments of updated information could be scrounged from prisoners, local civilians, or captured documents. There was also a manpower problem that rarely makes it into popular accounts of the Ardennes fighting. Trained surveyors, photogrammetrists, and lithographic printers are skilled specialists, and by late 1944, Germany's pool of such men had been drawn down repeatedly by the demands of the Eastern Front, by casualties among the topographic battalions themselves, and by a general combing out of technical personnel into infantry replacement units as the manpower crisis in the Wehrmacht deepened. A survey section that had once numbered a dozen experienced cartographers might by December 1944 consist of 2 or 3 overworked men and a handful of hastily trained conscripts expected to service the mapping needs of an entire corps. Fuel shortages that grounded much of the Luftwaffe's remaining reconnaissance strength compounded the problem further, since even a skilled photo interpreter is of little use without fresh imagery to interpret. Some German reconnaissance sorties over the Ardennes in the autumn of 1944 had to be scrubbed entirely for want of aviation spirit, leaving whole sectors of the front effectively unphotographed for weeks at a stretch. Nor could Germany simply lean on captured Allied material to fill the gap, however tempting that solution might sound. Captured maps were useful, and German units certainly made use of them where they could, but a captured sheet is a snapshot, accurate for the moment it was taken and steadily decaying in value with every day that passes afterwards, particularly in a fluid battle where minefields are laid overnight and supply dumps relocate within hours. Without the reproduction pipeline to update, reprint, and redistribute that captured information across an entire formation, a single seized map case offered a fleeting glimpse rather than a durable advantage. It could tell a divisional staff what the Americans knew last week. It could not tell them what the Americans knew this morning. None of this made the German offensive planners entirely blind. Wehrmacht planning for the Ardennes offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was conducted with considerable operational skill, and genuine surprise was achieved against thinly held American lines held by inexperienced or exhausted divisions resting in what was assumed, on both sides, to be a quiet sector. But surprise at the operational level masked a growing poverty at the tactical and logistical level. The fine-grained, constantly refreshed picture of roads, supply dumps, minefields, and unit boundaries that a modern mechanized offensive needs to sustain itself once the initial breakthrough is achieved. It is precisely that fine grain which the Americans, almost invisibly to their own high command, had been building for years. The problem, in other words, was not that Germany lacked maps. It was that Germany's maps had stopped growing, while America's had not stopped for a single day of the war. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. It was the product of a deliberate, years-long institutional buildup that began almost as soon as the United States entered the war, driven by planners who understood, from painful early experience in North Africa and Sicily where mapping shortfalls had genuinely hampered operations, that cartography could not be treated as an afterthought in a war of this scale. The organization responsible for the material that so unsettled that officer in the Schönberg cellar was the Army Map Service, headquartered in Washington, D.C., with forward reproduction and distribution units embedded directly with field armies in Europe. The Army Map Service had been expanded almost from scratch after 1941 into one of the largest cartographic enterprises the world had ever seen, drawing on trained surveyors, geologists, and lithographic printers pulled from American universities, state survey offices, and the private printing industry, and organized with the same relentless standardization that characterized American war production more broadly, the same instinct that gave the country interchangeable rifle parts and prefabricated Liberty ships. The technical innovation was not any single device, but a system, the Universal Transverse Mercator Grid, adopted by the U.S. Army in the early 1940s and applied consistently across every theater in which American forces fought. Rather than relying on a patchwork of local, national grid systems, each with its own quirks and reference points, as much of Europe had done for a century, American mapmakers overprinted a single, mathematically consistent grid across captured German, French, and Belgian base maps. A soldier trained to read a UTM grid reference in North Africa could pick up a map of the Ardennes and immediately understand it using exactly the same skills. An artillery forward observer could call in a fire mission using a six-figure grid reference, and a battery 10 kilometers away, working from a different sheet of the same series, would land shells within 100 meters of the intended target without either party needing to speak to the other about coordinate systems at all. Sitting alongside this was an industrial reproduction pipeline that would not have looked out of place in a newspaper printing house. Forward deployed engineer topographic battalions, small mobile units attached to each field army, carried lithographic presses, photographic enlargers, and stocks of specially treated paper directly behind the front lines. Aerial photographs taken by reconnaissance squadrons that morning could, in favorable conditions, be processed, interpreted by trained photo analysts, and overprinted onto existing base maps as revised overlays within 24 to 48 hours, sometimes faster for priority sectors. A base topographic map might be a beautifully engraved sheet dating back to a pre-war Belgian survey, showing contour lines to the meter. Overprinted on top of it, in a different colored ink, would be the previous night's known enemy positions, this week's minefield boundaries, and yesterday afternoon's aerial photograph interpretation of newly dug field fortifications. The base map provided permanence and detail. The overprint provided currency. Together, they gave a battalion commander something close to a living document, a map that was, in effect, rewritten every day of the campaign. Training was as much a part of the system as the presses and the paper. American infantry officers, artillery forward observers, and even many non-commissioned officers passed through map-reading instruction that drilled the UTM grid into muscle memory, treating a six-figure reference the way a modern driver treats reading a speedometer, an act performed without conscious thought under pressure. This mattered enormously in the chaos of the Ardennes, where units from different divisions, corps, and in places different armies entirely found themselves thrown together overnight to plug gaps torn open by the German advance. A gunner from one battalion could receive a fire mission relayed through 2 or 3 intermediaries, originating from an observer he had never met, belonging to a unit he had never trained with, and still drop shells within 100 meters of the intended target, because every link in that chain had been taught to read the same grid the same way. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this was by the standards of the time. Coalition and even single national armies elsewhere in the war frequently struggled with exactly this kind of coordination, losing precious minutes, or worse, to translation errors between incompatible map series. The engineer topographic battalions that supported this system were themselves a novel piece of organizational design, small, mobile units of perhaps a few hundred men each, equipped with portable offset presses, photographic darkrooms built into truck bodies, and enough specially coated paper stock to print tens of thousands of sheets without needing resupply from the rear for days at a time. These units moved with the armies they served, close enough to the front that a fresh aerial photograph taken at first light could realistically reach a printing press by mid-morning, and a finished, distributed overprint could be in the hands of a battalion S2 intelligence officer before the following dawn. The comparison that contemporary American engineers themselves sometimes drew was to a local newspaper, a small print shop, working around the clock, publishing a new edition every single day, except that the news it reported was the location of enemy machine gun nests and the load-bearing capacity of a bridge over the Our River. The physical objects themselves were unremarkable to look at, and that was rather the point. A standard American 1 to 25,000 tactical sheet weighed only a few dozen grams, printed on paper thin enough to fold into a map case roughly the size of a paperback novel, yet dense enough with information, contour intervals, road classifications by load-bearing capacity, water sources, forest cover useful for concealment, that a competent staff officer could plan an entire battalion attack from a single sheet. Production numbers for the European theater alone ran into the hundreds of millions of individual map sheets by the war's end, an almost unimaginable quantity of paper, ink, and skilled labor, though precise figures for any single period or sector remain difficult to pin down with confidence, since surviving Army map service records were compiled for internal logistics purposes rather than for posterity, and many specific unit-level print runs were never centrally tabulated in a form historians can now recover in full. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing beyond a tap of a button, which feels like a fair trade for 6,000 words of British-accented enthusiasm about Belgian cartography. The consequences of this mapping gap became starkly visible in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, though not, it must be said, in the way that first accounts sometimes suggest. The American collapse around Schnee-Eifel, where the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments of the 106th Infantry Division found themselves surrounded and were compelled to surrender roughly 7,000 men. One of the largest mass surrenders of American troops in the European theater, was above all a story of an inexperienced, thinly stretched division caught by a concentrated German assault along a quiet sector chosen precisely because it was thought too unimportant to warrant strong defense. It was not caused by any failure of American mapping. If anything, the quality and consistency of the maps found on the captured Americans, in their vehicles, and at their abandoned command posts became, almost as an afterthought to the tactical disaster itself, a source of genuine unease among the German units who processed the haul. Accounts from German participants in the Ardennes fighting, filtered through post-war interviews, unit war diaries, and the recollections gathered by Allied interrogators from prisoners taken later in the campaign, describe a recurring reaction among officers who examined captured American map material. Surprise, not at any single secret, but at the sheer consistency of it. The same grid system appeared on sheets recovered from a divisional headquarters as on sheets found in the pocket of a captured private. Overprints showing minefields and supply routes matched, sheet to sheet, unit to unit, in a way that German cartographic material, cobbled together from a dozen incompatible sources by December 1944, simply could not replicate. It is worth being honest here about the limits of the historical record. There is no single, universally agreed account naming one specific officer, one specific map, and one specific cellar that can be verified beyond dispute in the way a popular retelling might prefer. What survives is a pattern, repeated across multiple German accounts and Allied intelligence summaries compiled from prisoner interrogations, of German officers registering genuine surprise at the depth and standardization of American cartographic material recovered during the offensive's opening days. The Schönberg farmhouse scene that opened this film is a plausible, representative composite of that pattern rather than a single verified incident, and any documentary claiming otherwise with total certainty is reaching beyond what the surviving paperwork can support. What is far better documented is the operational value American forces drew from their mapping advantage once the initial shock of the German offensive wore off. At St. Vith, the scratch American defense organized by Brigadier General Bruce Clark relied heavily on rapidly updated overprint maps to coordinate scattered units from different divisions into a coherent defensive perimeter, a task that would have been close to impossible using inconsistent or outdated cartography. Clark's command, thrown together in the space of a single confused day from remnants of the 106th Division, elements of the 7th Armored Division, and a scattering of engineer and cavalry units that had never trained together, depended on every officer being able to trust that a grid reference relayed by a stranger from an unfamiliar unit meant exactly what it appeared to mean, without hesitation, translation, or the kind of costly clarifying radio traffic that a fluid, desperate defense could not afford to spend time on. Artillery battalions supporting the defense of Bastogne, encircled from December 20th, were able to call in fire missions with a precision that owed a great deal to the shared grid system, coordinating barrages from batteries that had never trained together and, in several documented instances, belonged to different corps entirely. Aerial resupply and, crucially, the accurate artillery fire that helped blunt German armored thrusts throughout the last 2 weeks of December depended on forward observers and artillery liaison officers reading from map sheets whose grids matched precisely across unit boundary, allowing fire support to be redirected rapidly as the front shifted, sometimes hourly, in the confused fighting of the Bulge's first fortnight. The defense of the Elsenborn Ridge in the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough, often overshadowed in popular memory by the more famous siege of Bastogne further south, depended heavily on exactly this kind of coordinated, map-referenced artillery fire, with multiple American divisional artillery battalions combining their fire onto single German assault columns using a shared grid reference system, a feat of coordination that blunted several of the most dangerous German thrusts of the entire offensive, and that would have been far harder to achieve with inconsistent cartography. The psychological effect on German forces is harder to quantify than the material effect, and honesty demands acknowledging that much of what circulates about German reactions to captured American maps rests on scattered anecdote rather than systematic survey data. Prisoner interrogation reports compiled by American intelligence officers in the weeks following the offensive do record German soldiers and junior officers expressing surprise at the volume and consistency of American logistical paperwork recovered during the fighting, though such reports must be read cautiously, since prisoners under interrogation have their own reasons, conscious or otherwise, for the impressions they choose to share. What can be said with more confidence is that German after-action assessments compiled later in the war increasingly noted American logistical and cartographic thoroughness as a contributing factor in the Wehrmacht's declining ability to sustain offensive operations, a grinding, cumulative disadvantage rather than a single dramatic revelation, and one that senior German officers interviewed by Allied historians after the war's end frequently cited in general terms, when explaining why the initial momentum of the Ardennes offensive proved so difficult to sustain once American forces recovered their footing after the first chaotic 72 hours. None of this should be read as a simple morality tale of American virtue against German neglect. Every army in this war made choices about where to invest scarce resources, and Germany's choices, however costly they proved in the Ardennes, were not irrational given the pressures the Reich was under by late 1944, fighting simultaneously on Eastern, Western, and Italian fronts against enemies whose combined industrial output dwarfed its own. Mapping lost out to munitions, to fuel, to the desperate attempt to keep divisions in the field at all, not because German planners undervalued good cartography, but because they had, by that stage of the war, almost nothing left to spare for it. The German army did not lack skilled cartographers or capable field survey units throughout the war, and it would be wrong to suggest otherwise. German topographic sections attached to individual corps and armies continued to produce serviceable, sometimes excellent, tactical maps for specific operations right through to 1945, and early war German cartography in France and Poland had in places outpaced Allied equivalents. The difference by December 1944 lay not in raw surveying skill but in system and scale. Germany's mapping effort remained fragmented across service branches and regional commands, was starved of the raw materials, printing capacity and reconnaissance aircraft needed to keep pace with a fluid front, and had never adopted anything resembling a single unified grid across the different fronts on which German forces fought. The American system, by contrast, applied one grid, one production pipeline, and one distribution network across every American formation in the European theater, a scale of standardization that only a combatant with America's uninterrupted industrial base, safe from strategic bombing on its own soil, could realistically sustain through 5 years of continuous warfare. British forces fighting alongside the Americans operated their own well-developed survey and mapping organization, built on a long tradition stretching back through the Ordnance Survey, and the two allies had worked hard since 1942 to harmonize their grid systems and reference data, specifically so that British and American units could coordinate fire and movement without translation errors between different map series, an effort that paid clear dividends in the joint operations of late 1944 and early 1945, including the deployment of British XXX Corps to help contain the northern flank of the Bulge. Where the American system pulled distinctly ahead was in the sheer forward-deployed reproduction capacity attached directly to field armies, allowing overprints to be generated and distributed to divisional level within a day or two of new aerial photography being taken,